Thank you so much for being here, and to Bethany for the invitation to speak. Like Tony Lynn said, my name is Cascade Sorte. I'm at the University of California, Irvine. I'm actually a marine ecologist, so I represent the aquatic portion of the group here. I'm glad to see there are also aquatic ecologists here as well as terrestrial ecologists. I study marine invasive species, which includes fouling species, such as the species that you see fouling this mussel here on the top right. I've also done some work on Spartina invasion in San Francisco Bay, which is that picture on the bottom. And I also owned an invasive species for a while. This on the top left here is my late pet Bromy. Bromy came to my family in a plant in a bromeliad that my husband purchased for me and was shipped from Florida. And when he unpacked the plant, he found this invasive Cuban tree frog in the package. And so, of course, we were then trying to figure out what do you do with this species. And it was an interesting kind of intersection of my private life and my public life. And so Cuban tree frogs are not really a cuddly pet. You may know that they're toxic. So after Bromy passed away during a heat wave, which is very ironic, last fall, we now have a cuddly pet. We now have a parakeet living in our house. So, but please don't ask me any questions about frogs, because I always put Bromy up on my slide to kind of remember him or her, but I really don't know anything about frogs. So I'm here today talking to you because because as soon as I finished my thesis work at UC Davis as a marine ecologist, I was really interested in understanding whether the patterns that I was finding in the marine study system I was working on were general across all aquatic ecosystems, freshwater and marine, as well as terrestrial ecosystems. And that brought me to meet some of the great individuals that are in the room here today, and we banded together to form a working group. And some of you may know that from Monday to Wednesday of this week, there were 14 of us that were working together on discussing climate change and invasive species and doing some synthetic work. And so I'll be talking about some of that work today, and I really want to acknowledge the co-authors, especially Jenica Allen and Bethany Bradley, who led the two syntheses that I'll talk about a little bit today. So my goal in this talk is to kind of summarize where we've been today and why we think that climate change and invasions together is a really important problem, and some of the emerging work, like I said, out of that working group that's not quite published yet, and also just to remind us about some of the topics that we've discussed so that we're ready for the reception which comes after my talk. So you get a prize at the end. So I also want to thank the funding sources of the working groups, the private foundation, the Borchardt Foundation, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, and then RISC and also University of Michigan helped to fund some of the meetings that we've been at this week, as well as the members of my lab. You'll see a little bit of my lab work as well. So we're here because biodiversity is declining. I was interested to see that biodiversity was the biggest tagline on that exercise, on that answer about the impacts we were concerned about. And threats are increasing, and clearly there are many threats to global biodiversity, and some of them are listed here. They include habitat change or loss, climate change, invasive species, overexploitation, and pollution. And the level of declines that we're seeing in global biodiversity have actually led some people to call this the sixth mass extinction. And so here are climate change and invasive species, and this is just a summary actually from a textbook that has the different biomes listed vertically, and you can see that the color of these boxes is the degree of impact that the authors of this study thought these different threats have had in the past and what the threat might be in the future. And we could actually kind of argue about whether we think this is accurately portraying the past and future impacts of climate change and invasions. But one thing I just want to point out here is that almost all of these arrows are pointing straight up or going up. So these impacts are increasing. It's not like we're just going to be dealing with the status quo in the future. So we know that both climate change and invasions are individually threatening biodiversity, but one thing that especially our working group has been really interested in, and I know a lot of you are interested in, is whether or not these two threats could interact. And back in about almost 20 years ago now, Enrique Sala did this I guess, horizon scanning of different biodiversity threats, and at that time said that the interactions among these causes of biodiversity change represented one of the largest uncertainties in projection of future biodiversity change. And I would argue that that knowledge gap still exists. So here's how I think about the interaction between these two biodiversity threats. So one of the species that I study is the blue mussel, which is a critical foundation species in rocky intertidal ecosystems. Blue mussels are their tolerance to environmental conditions is increasingly being exceeded by things like heat waves. And so that causes climate change to have a negative effect on these blue mussel, these foundation species populations. At the same time, especially here on the East Coast, blue mussel populations are threatened by an increase in predators, in invasive green crabs. And so here's, these two arrows are indicating an additive effect of these two threats. But here's where these effects may be more than additive. If climate change benefits the invasive green crab, then that leads to an indirect negative effect on this native species. So this is just trying to illustrate how the interaction can lead to a super additive or a synergistic effect. And so what are the mechanisms that we think can cause these two threats to interact? Well, here's the way that I've kind of listed these three mechanisms, and I actually saw these kind of covered in Jeff's introductory talk as well, so you'll see some parallels there. I come to this question as an ecophysiologist, so when I look at a species, what I really want to know about is what is its fundamental niche, how does its the performance of its population vary across an environmental gradient? And if we know something about a species' performance or how it does at different environmental conditions, then we can make some predictions about how it will do when those environmental conditions change. So for example, across a range of temperatures from low on the left to high on the right, we typically think that performance should be at its peak somewhere in the middle, usually not right in the middle, but somewhere in the middle. And that then if you're currently starting below that peak, any increase in, say, temperature would lead to an increase in the performance of that species, or also potentially an increase in the abundance of that species if this performance metric is something like survival or reproduction or growth. On the other hand, if the species is currently living at its optimum, then you would expect that any increase in temperature would lead to a decrease in the performance or abundance of that species. So I think this gives us a really nice framework to think about species across a community, whether they're all native or whether there's native and invasive species included, because species that have lower tolerances or lower performance curves are the ones that we expect to decrease in performance as the climate warms. And this leads us to this expectation that climate change will favor species with thermal tolerances that are higher or warmer. So we can also use this to get to the expectation that climate change will favor species that have broader tolerances, because if all species have somewhere close to the same optimum, then any increase in temperature would be more detrimental to species that have narrower tolerance ranges, but less detrimental to species that have broader tolerance ranges. So what I'm getting to here is the fact that that the same traits that determine these climate change winners could also confer invasion success. And this could be a reason that we're seeing invasive species doing better under climate change. For example, if climate change is favoring species with higher or broader thermal tolerances, then if species that have higher or broader thermal tolerances are also better at becoming invasive, that is basically giving us that situation that leads to a super additive effect of climate change and invasions. And I've been thinking about why the same traits might confer invasion success and lead to climate change winners. And one that I've thought about is the fact that species that have broader tolerance ranges or are more cosmopolitan already, they may be more likely to be transported just because they occur across a broader range of locations where you could pick up those propagules that could be spread. On the other hand, species that can tolerate higher temperatures would be better able to cope with higher temperatures in a recipient region. So I've seen some evidence of this particular mechanism in the fowling communities that I've studied. These are results from maximum thermal tolerance limit studies that I've done, where I've looked at the LT50. So the LT50 is the temperature that's lethal to 50% of individuals in a population. So it's related to the dose response curve that I showed earlier. And the temperature that kills 50% of individuals is higher for invasive species than it is for native species. So invasive species can tolerate higher maximum temperatures. They have higher tolerance limits. And this comes from a study that compared 4 native and 6 invasive species in a fowling community in Northern California, not too far north of San Francisco Bay. So I've seen evidence that in the marine fowling community that invasive species have higher tolerance limits, and I've also seen evidence that they have broader tolerance ranges. A master's student that I advised also compared the temperatures that the invasive and the native species in this community occur at globally, and found that the invasive species occur at a broader range of temperatures, than the native species do. So this suggests that this particular mechanism, that invasive species do have traits that are making them more likely to win or to do better under climate change. There's another mechanism, and some of these mechanisms seem to be related, and that is that invasive species could be more resistant to disturbance. And this is something that I've also tested in this particular community. So another master's student that I worked with did some heat wave experiments in this community, where he took an established community, a community that was established on an experimental plate like this one. That's a 10 by 10 centimeter PVC plate. And he then exposed it to a heat wave, which was an increase in seawater temperature. And what I'm showing on this graph is the species richness, or the number of species in that community, both before and after he gave them that heat shock or that heat wave. And in blue is the control treatment, and in orange is the heat wave treatment. And you can see that the species richness was about the same before the treatment, but after the treatment, the plates or the communities that were exposed to that heat wave had a decrease in richness or diversity, which is, what we expect with warming, especially rapid warming. But what was even more interesting is that the balance of native to invasive species in that community also shifted in the way that we would expect if the invasive species were favored by that kind of disturbance. Before that heat wave treatment, about 65% of the space in the community was taken up by invasive species. But after the treatment, in the communities that experienced a heat wave, about 95% of the space was taken up by invasive species. So what I think is really interesting about this example is that these kinds of disturbance that are becoming more frequent with climate change could lead to a decrease in species richness and an increase in relative abundance of invasive species that happens really rapidly. A third related mechanism is the response of native and invasive species to an increase in resources. So what I was just showing was the immediate response to that heat wave. So we would call that resistance to a climate disturbance. But we might also think about resilience to a climate disturbance, which I think is something that Jeff and maybe some others mentioned earlier today. And that would be how quickly can they recover? And the recovery in this particular system, the fowling community, relates to how quickly the species can take up space, which is a limiting resource in that system. So here I actually want to show some results from a synthesis that our working group did, where we were looking at the response of native and invasive species to different aspects of climate change. We looked at increase in temperature, increase in carbon dioxide, and changes in precipitation, both increase and decrease, since we know that that's going to vary regionally. And this figure requires a little bit of clarification, because a positive value here does not mean that the species are really doing better under climate change. It just means that the invasive species are doing better or responding more positively than the native species. So they might, both of them, be experiencing higher mortality, but the mortality is greater for the native in this case. The invader is still doing better. And so what we found across these different climate drivers, and then we also broke out aquatic and terrestrial species for the warming and the CO2 examples, is that the invasive species tended to be favored in most of these comparisons. And you can see that's true for 6 out of 8, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, am I counting? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of 8 of the comparisons. The cases where the invasive species were not doing better was where resources were actually decreased. So that's over here where precipitation was decreased, and here where temperature was increased and water stress was probably then also increased. Interestingly, I didn't add any slides about this, but we actually saw a more significant response of the aquatic systems, which are the cases here where that 95% confidence interval is not overlapping 0. So this is a picture of the individuals that were part of the first working group that that was started in 2011 that was mentioned earlier. I think, can't remember who mentioned that, maybe Regan. And as Regan said, you can see us quite a bit younger here. There's me, Regan, here's Bethany, here's Jeff that gave our introductory talk. And back in 2011 and 2012, we were really interested in the relative success of native and invasive species under climate change. Would climate change favor invaders over native species? But what we've really moved towards now is trying to think about the effects of climate change on invader impacts. And so more recently, we've been focused, really trying to focus in on impacts. And this is a picture of the individuals that were part of our most recent working group. You can see some others that joined us. Monty is here. Jenica has joined us more recently. And our first working group meeting was at this castle. And really, you can get good work done at castles, I can attest. So one of the first things that we needed to do with this working group was to define impact, in this case, and give it an empirical definition so that we would actually be able to calculate it. So we're trying to come up with basically an equation that we can use so that we can figure out what we need to measure so that we can calculate impact. And this table comes from a study by Mads Thompson that summarizes the way that different people have tried to calculate impact empirically. And basically, looking across all of these sort of attempts to come up with an equation, what we come down to is that we think the impact of invasive species is a function of invader abundance. If we're thinking more broadly, it's also a function of its range size, and then something about per capita effect, or the effect of a single individual of an invasive species. And sometimes there's also a recognition that there are aspects of the recipient community that are really important as well. And I put that in italics here because that's one that we still really haven't treated well enough, and that's come up a little bit in our discussion today too. So. When we were talking about or looking earlier at the effects of climate change on invader success, we were mostly focused on abundance and range size. But now we really want to know how abundance and range size, we want to look at impacts as a function of the native species response. And I have per capita effect also shaded here because that's another one that we've tabled for the moment. So I'm going to tell you about 2 different syntheses that we're working on right now to try to understand how climate change is affecting the impacts of invasive species. The first is a synthesis that's led by Bethany Bradley. And this synthesis, this project came out of the observation that we know that overall, when an invasive species is present, that tends to reduce the abundance of native species. So invasive species tend to, I guess in this case we could say, have a negative impact if our response is native abundance. And these are the results here from a meta-analysis that showed this across different taxa, from fish to benthic invertebrates to macrophytes, that overall the effect is negative. But what we don't know is how the impact changes with increasing invader abundance. And I think once I go through these examples, it will make sense why this is really important, we think, from both an empirical perspective, but also really from a management perspective, I would think. So there are 3 different ways that we could envision the effect of an invasive, the impact of invasive species varying across its abundance. First of all, as you increase the abundance of an invasive species, you might see that the native response decreases linearly. For example, you add 1 invasive individual, you add 1 green crab, you take away 5 mussels. You add another green crab, you take away another 5 mussels, right? So that's sort of one hypothesis we could have. On the other hand, maybe the impact of the invasive species increases only at high invader abundance. You know, maybe you, oh, I didn't think of examples. I shouldn't do this on the fly. You know how you do this when you're teaching and then you just confuse everyone? But imagine that there's a species that you have to increase the abundance to quite a high level before it starts having an impact on the natives. And you can imagine that the management for these different situations could be really different, because in this situation, you really don't need to worry about this invasive species until it's at relatively high abundance. And you have actually a long time to enact whatever management or policies you're going to enact. On the other hand, you might have this kind of situation where the impact increases greatly initially. So this is what we might expect when a species has a large per capita effect, where it just takes 1 invader to have a really strong impact on the native system. And I would think that this is a situation where the proactive management would become so important, because as soon as the invader arrives, then the native responses are going to happen really quickly. So we did a cross-system meta-analysis to try to understand what the shape of this relationship between invader abundance and native response is. And this pulled from 201 papers and over 1,000 studies. And so the goal here is to pull together all the data that we can get on this relationship to try to come up with a general pattern. And I'm just going to caution you that this is not published yet, and so these are not the figures that you will be seeing in the final publication, but it gives you a gist of what we're finding so far. So when the invasive species is a predator, we're seeing more of the situation where the impact is increasing at very low invader abundance. So we're seeing that curvilinear response, which is kind of what we hypothesized. We expected that predators would have strong impacts at low abundance. And you can also see there that they are having a negative impact. So the native response is going down. Native response might be, say, abundance of the native species or diversity. When it's a competitor, again, we're seeing another negative response. And I think in the most recent iteration of this figure, which we were working on just a couple of days ago, this is actually looking to be more curvilinear than we thought. However, when the native species, when the invasive species is a resource, we're not seeing a significant response. And we actually thought we might see a positive response. We thought we might see that the native species were maybe using the invasive species as a resource. So as you increase the invader, you might actually see a positive effect on the natives, but we didn't actually see that, perhaps due to some indirect effects of the invader. So we thought this was really interesting because, again, the impact is increasing with abundance for both predators and competitors, and it's especially increasing very quickly at low invader abundance for predators. And so, although I am an empiricist, I would think that this would lead one to want to manage for low levels of invasion, including, in these cases, putting more resources into proactive and early response measures. So I'll switch gears now and tell you a little bit about the second synthesis that we've been doing. This synthesis is led by Jenica Allen, and so if you have any questions about this one, I would direct you to Jenica. And this synthesis is actually looking for studies that have evaluated whether the impacts of climate change and invasions are synergistic. And so what do I mean by that? Well, let's see. If you look at the figure here, we might imagine that as compared to a control situation where there's no climate change or no invasive species present, that adding an invasive species might cause the native species response to go down. Maybe that's diversity, for example, of native species. And climate change also might cause diversity to decrease. Well, if these two effects were additive, then we would think that you would just add up the length of that red arrow and the length of that yellow arrow, and that would give you the effect of climate change plus invasions on diversity. That would be an additive response. On the other hand, if the response of diversity is even greater than you would expect by adding those two responses together, that would be our synergistic response. Or we might, on the other hand, see an antagonistic response where actually the effect of these added together is even less than would have been expected. So we did another cross-system meta-analysis, and this figure here is showing you on the y-axis the number of measured responses. And Jenica, how many papers was this based on? Do you remember? 38 papers. Okay, 38 papers and 187 studies. So you can see this was a much smaller sample size than the previous meta-analysis I told you about. But here are the different climate change drivers that we were looking at: carbon dioxide, decrease in precipitation, addition of nitrogen, so nitrogen deposition, hypoxia, pH, ocean acidification, and increase in temperature. And then the colors on these bars, oh, thanks. Really? 25 minutes? Okay, so the colors on these bars show you the type of response that we were seeing. Overall, we found that about half of the responses were additive, and then we saw both antagonistic and synergistic responses. We found that antagonistic responses were most common when we were looking at responses to drought, or the interaction between invasions and drought, which is what we might have expected from our previous meta-analysis, where we found that natives were more drought tolerant. And synergisms tended to be more common when resources were increased, especially with nitrogen deposition. And so this was really interesting because it showed that synergistic responses do occur, and it gives us a sense of when we might expect them. So as I said, we were meeting earlier this week. One of the new projects that we started this week, and one of the topics that we're studying in my lab at UC Irvine, is the impacts of what we might call climate invaders. These are native species that are expanding their range under climate change. This is something that has caught the attention of our local press. This is Piper Wallingford, who's here with us today. And we're studying a couple of climate invaders, potential climate invaders, including a mussel and a carnivorous snail called the dark unicorn whelk that seem to be expanding their range in Southern California. These species co-occur, and so there's a lot of question about whether or not they will start to compete. And I'll skip this in the interest of time. But climate invaders are a real concern because a meta-analysis that I did about almost 10 years ago now showed that the impacts of native species expanding their ranges can be of the same magnitude as the impacts of non-native species invasions. And so that suggests that this isn't just something that we should turn a blind eye to, and I think that we also got some stories about sleeper species that we could use to inform these studies as well. So with that, I'll move into basically trying to summarize some of the things that I've heard in the presentations today. So this is the pre-reception review, after which we get to go off and I think have something to drink. There may not be a castle involved, I'm not quite sure, but just give you some ideas of what we've been talking about and maybe ideas to seed your future conversations. So here's what we've heard today, just a little line by line from each of our speakers. Jeff Duke started us off and gave us a great introduction to remind us of how the climate is changing and how and why invasive species might benefit more than natives. Monse Vila told us about ICAT, which is an accessible and objective impact assessment protocol. And then Bethany gave us an example of how ICAT can be used to develop watch lists for future invaders. We heard from Brendan Quirion about how pests are killing forests. I was impressed to hear that they're decreasing area even more than increasing fire frequency. But not just affecting individual trees, also changing overall productivity, biomass, and the direction of carbon dynamics, including shifting, in some cases, from our forest from carbon sequestration to being a carbon source. Regan Early then took us back in this afternoon at a really large scale, thinking about invasion prevention capacity and how that can lag behind invasion threat, especially in developing countries. Jenica Allen told us that invasive alien species listing varies a lot by state in terms of the protocols used, but they often all draw from IPC recommendations, which she suggested might be a way that we could increase coordination. We then heard from Julie Richberg about formalized and coordinated entities being key for listing and invasive species regulation. Jennifer Price-Tack told us about how climate change is favoring aquatic alien invasive species, including rock snot. We won't forget that one, yuck. Brittany told us about how climate change may wake up some alien invasive species that are currently naturalized but may be problematic in the future. And Steve Frank then talked more about sleeper insect species and how these seem to be increasing during warm periods and at warm locations, including looking across rural and urban gradients. We then heard from Greg Sargis about incorporating climate change predictions into restoration. And some questions and challenges that I heard, so I'm sure you all took away different things than I did, but some that I thought were really interesting and I'd like to discuss some more are how we could incorporate management priorities into these impact assessment protocols, which you can see are designed to be relatively accessible and simplistic at this point, but can also be kind of molded to fit our priorities. We talked about whether it's even possible to predict and prevent invasions, or whether we should just focus on increasing native system resilience. I heard a lot of people talking about issues in terms of coordinating and funding efforts for invasive alien species research and management. So any ideas, send them my way especially. How to get the word out to the public and affect behaviors. We had some ideas about some of the resources that we could be using in terms of master gardeners and folks that work at nurseries, and also just kind of the language being important. There was a real interest in time and funding for proactive measures, especially I heard this in small groups in terms of early detection and rapid response, and thinking ahead not only about how to keep invasive species out, but also how to restore systems in which we're actually removing invasive species so that we don't just get basically successive invasions moving through. Some challenges related to funding and coordinating management across geopolitical boundaries, such as states versus watersheds, and public-private boundaries. And identifying sleeper species that are present at low abundance, but could undergo population booms under climate change. And finally, really interested in this discussion about whether we should incorporate assisted colonization into our restoration, such as replanting with southern species or with southern genotypes. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. I don't know if Bethany maybe wants to jump in with some, oh good, Tony Lynn's gonna jump in with logistics, but if you're interested in any of the aspects I talked about in terms of marine invasions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.